Hi, everybody. Welcome to To Kill a Mockingbird, Chapter 16. Chapter 15. Wait, hold on. First, look at my shirt. Can you read that? What would Atticus do? Yes. Okay. Chapter 15, we left off, was the mob chapter. The friendly mob in the beginning, and then the mob that wanted to kill Atticus that night, or wanted to kill Tom Robinson, or Atticus if he got in the way. We pick up right as they're walking home. Right at the end of 15, they're walking home, and Atticus ruffles Jem's hair. And as they're getting in is where we pick up in chapter 16. Jem heard me. He thrust his head around the connecting door. As he came to my bed, Atticus's light flashed on. We stayed where we were until it went off. We heard him turn over, and we waited until he was still again. Jem took me to his room and put me in bed beside him. Try to go to sleep, he said. It'll be all over after tomorrow, maybe. We had come in quietly so not as to wake Auntie. Atticus killed the engine in the driveway and coasted into the garage. We went in the back door into our rooms without a word. I was very tired and was drifting into sleep when the memory of Atticus calmly folding his newspaper and pushing back his hat became Atticus standing in the middle of an empty, waiting street, pushing up his glasses. What's that a reference to? That's a reference to the mad dog. So Scout connects the idea of that physically dangerous situation, and she realizes that they were in a very dangerous situation there. Standing in the middle of an empty waiting street, pushing up his glasses. The full meaning of the night's events hit me, and I began crying. Jem was awfully nice about it. For once, he didn't remind me that people nearly 9 years old didn't do things like that. Everybody's appetite was delicate this morning. So this is Monday morning. Trial starts today. Except Jem's. He ate his way through 3 eggs. Atticus watched in frank admiration. And Alexandra sipped coffee and radiated waves of disapproval. Children who slipped out at night were a disgrace to the family. Atticus said he was right glad his disgraces had come along. But Auntie said, nonsense. Mr. Underwood was there all the time. You know, it's a funny thing about Braxton Underwood, said Atticus. He despises Negroes, won't have one near him. Local opinion held Mr. Underwood to be an intense, profane little man whose father, in a fey fit of humor, christened Braxton Bragg, a name Mr. Underwood had done his best to live down. Atticus said naming people after Confederate generals made slow, steady drinkers. Calpurnia was serving Aunt Alexandra more coffee, and she shook her head at what I thought was a pleading, winning look. You're still too little, she said. I'll tell you when you ain't. I said, it might help my stomach. All right, she said, and got a cup from the sideboard. She poured 1 tablespoonful of coffee into it and filled the cup to the brim with milk. I thanked her by sticking out my tongue at it and looked up to catch Auntie's warning frown, but she was frowning at Atticus, so Scout wanted to drink coffee, and Calpurnia was like, no, you're not old enough. She waited until Calpurnia was in the kitchen and then said, don't talk like that in front of them. Talk like what in front of whom? Atticus asked. Talk like that in front of Calpurnia. You said Braxton Underwood despises Negroes right in front of her. Well, I'm sure Cal knows it. Everybody in Macomb knows it. I was beginning to notice a subtle change in my father these days that came out when he talked with Aunt Alexandra. It was a quiet digging in, never outright irritation. There was a faint starchiness in his voice when he said, anything's fit to say at the table is fit to say in front of Cal. She knows what she means to this family. I don't think it's a good habit, Atticus. It encourages them. You know how they talk among themselves. Everything happens in this town's out to the quarters before sundown. She's talking about gossip. My father put down his knife. I don't know if any law says they can't talk. Maybe if we didn't give them so much to talk about, they would be quiet. Why don't you drink your coffee, Scout? I was playing in it with a spoon. I thought of I was playing with a spoon. Scout says, I thought Mr. Cunningham was a friend of ours. You told me a long time ago he was. He still is, said Atticus. But last night he wanted to hurt you, I said. Atticus placed his fork beside his knife and pushed his plate aside. Mr. Cunningham is basically a good man. He said he just has his blind spots along with the rest of us. Jem spoke. I don't call that a blind spot. He'd have killed you last night when he was first there. He might have hurt me a little, Atticus conceded. But son, you'll understand folks a little better when you're older. A mob is always made up of people, no matter what. Mr. Cunningham was part of a mob last night, but he was still a man. Every mob in every little southern town is always made up of people, you know. Doesn't say much for him, does it? I'll say not, said Jem. So it took an 8-year-old child to bring them to their senses, didn't it? Said Atticus. That proves something, that a gang of wild animals can be stopped simply because they're still human. Maybe we need a police force of children. You children last night made Walter Cunningham stand in my shoes for a minute. That was enough. A gang of wild animals can be stopped simply because they're still human. Scout brought their humanity back. That innocence made them recognize humanity, and that changed their actions. A police force of children. I wonder what our world would be like if we had a police force of children. Would that change the actions of some? I don't know. I'm on the top of 211. Well, I hoped Jem would understand folks a little better when he was older, but I wouldn't. First day Walter comes back to school will be his last, I affirmed. You will not touch him, said Atticus flatly. I don't want either of you bearing a grudge about this thing, no matter what happens. You see, don't you? Said Aunt Alexandra. What comes of things like this? Don't say I haven't told you, she finished. Atticus said he'd never said that, pushed out his chair, and got up. There's a day ahead, so excuse me. Jem, I don't want you in Scout downtown today, please. Atticus departed. Dill came bounding down the hall into the dining room. It's all over town this morning, he announced, about how we held off 100 folks with our bare hands. Aunt Alexandra stared him into silence. You know who else stares people into silence? Mitzi. It was not 100 folks, she said, and nobody held anybody off. It was just a nest of those Cunninghams, drunk and disorderly. Aye, Auntie, that's just Dill's way, said Jem. He signaled us to follow him. Y'all stay in the yard now, she said, as we made our way to the front porch. It was like Saturday. People from the south end of county passed our house in a leisurely but steady stream. Mr. Dolphus Raymond lurched by his thoroughbred. Lurched on by his thoroughbred. Don't see how he stays in that saddle, murmured Jem. How can you stand to get drunk before 8:30 in the morning? A wagon load of ladies rattled past us. They wore cotton sunbonnets and dresses with long sleeves. A bearded man in a wool hat drove them. Yonder's some Mennonites, Jem said to Dill. They don't have buttons. They live deep in the woods, did most of their trading across the river, and rarely came to make 'em. Dill was interested. They've all got blue eyes, Jem explained. And the men can't shave after they marry. Their wives their wives like for 'em to tickle 'em with their beards. That's weird. Mr. X. Billups rode by on a mule and waved to us. He's a funny man, said Jem. X is his name, not his initial. He was in court one time and they asked him his name. He said X. Billups. Clerk said to spell it, and he said X. Asked him again, and he said X. They kept at it till he wrote X on a sheet of paper and held it up for everybody to see. They asked him where he got his name and said that's the way his folks signed him up when he was born. As the county went by us, Jem gave Dill the histories and general attitudes of the more prominent figures. Mr. Tenshaw Jones voted the straight prohibition ticket. Miss Emily Davis dipped snuff in private. Mr. Byron Waller could play the violin. Mr. Jake Slade was cutting his third set of teeth. A wagon load of unsteady, stern-faced citizens appeared. When they pointed to Miss Maudie Atkinson's yard, ablaze with summer flowers, Miss Maudie herself came out on the porch. There was an odd thing about Miss Maudie. On her porch she was too far away for us to see her features clearly, but we could always catch her mood by the way she stood. Now she was standing arms akin, her shoulders drooping a little, her head cocked to one side, her glasses winking in the sunlight. We knew she wore the grin of uttermost wickedness. I swear I'm a modern day Miss Maudie. The driver of the wagon slowed down his mules, and a shrill-voiced woman called out, "He that cometh in vain departeth in darkness." That means you're so worried about your flowers, you're probably going to hell. Miss Maudie answered, "A merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance. I guess that the foot washers thought that the devil was quoting scripture for his own purposes, as the driver speeded his mules. When they objected to Miss Maudie's yard, why they objected to Miss Maudie's yard was a mystery, heightened in my mind because for someone who spent all the daylight hours outdoors, Miss Maudie's command of the scriptures was formidable. "You going to court this morning?" asked Jem. We had strolled over to her house. "I am not," she said. "I have no business with the court this morning." "Aren't you going downtown to watch?" asked Dill. "I am not," answered Miss Maudie. "It's morbid watching a poor devil on trial for his life. Look at all those folks. It's like a Roman carnival." "They have to try him in public, Miss Maudie," I said. "It wouldn't be right if they didn't." "I'm quite aware of that," she said. "Just because it's public, I don't have to go, do I?" Miss Stephanie Crawford came by. She wore a hat and gloves. She said. "Look at all those folks. You'd think William Jennings Bryan was speaking." "And where are you going, Stephanie?" inquired Miss Maudie. "To the Jitney Jungle." Miss Maudie said she'd never seen Miss Stephanie go to the Jitney Jungle in a hat in all of her life. "Well," said Miss Stephanie, "I thought I might just go look in the courthouse to see what Atticus is up to." "You be careful he doesn't hand you a subpoena." We asked Miss Maudie to elucidate, to explain. She said Miss Stephanie seemed to know so much about the case she might as well be called on to testify. She's a gossip. We held off till noon when Atticus came home to dinner, which is lunch, and said they spent the morning picking the jury. After dinner, we stopped by for Dill and went to town. It was a gala occasion. There was no room at the public hitching rail for another animal. Mules and wagons were parked under every available tree. The courthouse square was covered with picnic parties sitting on newspapers, washing down biscuit and syrup with warm milk from fruit jars. Some people were gnawing on cold chicken and cold fried pork chops. The more affluent, rich, chased their food with drugstore Coca-Cola in bulb-shaped soda glasses. Greasy-faced children popped the whip through the crowd. That's a game that they played. And babies lunched at their mother's breasts. In the far corner of the square, the Negroes sat quietly in the sun, dining on sardines and crackers and the more vivid flavors of knee-high cola. Mr. Dolphus Raymond sat with them. By the way, Dolphus Raymond is a white dude. Jem said, "He's drinking out of a sack." Mr. Dolphus Raymond seemed to be so doing. Two yellow drugstore straws ran from his mouth to the depths of a brown paper bag. Ain't ever seen anybody do that," murmured Dill. "How does he keep what's in it in it?" Jem giggled. "He's got a Coca-Cola bottle full of whiskey in there. It's not to upset the ladies. You'll see him sip it all afternoon. He'll step out for a while and fill it back up." "Why's he sitting with the colored folks?" "Always does. He likes them better than he likes us, I reckon. Lives by himself way down near the county line. He's got a colored woman and all sorts of mixed children. I'll show you some of them if we ever see him." "He doesn't look like trash," said Dill. Notice this conversation. "He's not. He owns all one side of the riverbank down there, and he's from a real old family to boot." "Then why does he do like that? Hang out with the black folks?" "That's just his way," said Jem. "They say he never got over his wedding. He was supposed to marry one of the Spencer ladies, I think. They were going to have a huge wedding, but they didn't. After the rehearsal, the bride went upstairs and blew her head off. Shotgun. She pulled the trigger with her toes." "Did they ever know why?" asked Dill. "No," said Jem. "Nobody ever knew quite why, but Mr. Dolphus. They said it was because she found out about his colored woman, his mistress. He reckoned he could keep her and get married too. He's been sort of drunk ever since, though. He's real good to those children." Jem, I asked, "What's a mixed child?" "Half white, half colored," Jem answered. "You've seen 'em, Scout. You know that red, kinky-headed kid kinky-headed one that delivers for the drugstore? He's half white. They're real sad." "Sad? How come?" I asked. "They don't belong anywhere. Colored folks won't have them because they're half white, and white folks won't have them because they're colored. So they're just in-betweens. They don't belong anywhere. But Mr. Dolphus now, they say he shipped two of his up north. They don't mind 'em up north. Yonder's one of 'em." A small boy clutching a Negro woman's hand walked toward us. He looked all Negro to me. He was rich chocolate with flaring nostrils and beautiful teeth. Sometimes he would skip happily, and the Negro woman tugged his hand to make him stop. Jem waited until they passed us. "That's one of the little ones," he said. "How can you tell?" asked Dill. "He looked black to me." "You can't sometimes, not unless you know who they are, but he's half Raymond all right." "But how can you tell?" I asked. "I told you, Scout, you just have to know who they are." "Well, how do you know we ain't Negroes?" "Uncle Jack Finch says we really don't know. He says as far as he can trace back the Finches we ain't, but for all he knows we might have come straight out of Ethiopia during the Old Testament." "Well, if we came out during the Old Testament, it's too long ago to matter." "That's what I thought," said Jem, "but around here, once you have a drop of Negro blood, that makes you all black. Hey, look." Some invisible signal had made the luncheons on the square rise and scatter bits of newspaper, cellophane, and wrapping paper. Children came to mothers, babies were cradled on hips as men in sweat-stained hats collected their families and herded them through the courthouse doors. In the far corner of the square, the Negroes and Mr. Dolphus Raymond stood up and dusted their breeches, their pants. There were few women and children among them, which seemed to dispel the holiday mood. They waited patiently at the doors behind the white families. "Let's go in," said Dill. "Now we better wait till they get in. Atticus might not like it if he sees us," said Jem. The Macomb County Courthouse was faintly reminiscent of Arlington in one respect. The concrete pillars supporting its south roof were too heavy for their light burden. The pillars were all that remained standing when the original courthouse burned in 1856. Another courthouse was built around them. It's better to say built in spite of them, but for the south porch, the Macomb County Courthouse was early Victorian, presented an unoffensive vista when seen from the north. From the other side, however, Greek Revival columns clashed with a big 19th century clock tower housing a rusty, unreliable instrument, a view indicating a people determined to preserve every physical scrap of the past. Reminds me of the courthouse in Back to the Future. Have you seen that? To reach the courthouse on the second floor, one passed sundry sunless county cubbyholes. The tax assessor, the tax collector, the county clerk, the county solicitor, the circuit clerk, the judge of probate lived in cool, dim hutches that smelled of decaying record books mingled with old damp cement and stale urine. It was necessary to turn on the lights in the daytime. There was always a film of dust on the rough floorboards. The inhabitants of these offices were creatures of their environment, little gray-faced men. They seemed untouched by wind or sun. We knew there was a crowd, but we had not bargained for the multitudes in the first-floor hallway. I got separated from Jem and Dill, but made my way toward the wall by the stairwell, knowing Jem would come for me eventually. I found myself in the middle of the Idlers Club and made myself as unobtrusive as possible. Just tried to blend in. This was a group of white-shirted, khaki-trousered, suspendered old men who had spent their lives doing nothing and passed their twilight days doing the same on pine benches under the live oaks in the square. Attentive critics of the courthouse business, Atticus knew as much law as the Chief Justice from long years of observation. Normally, they were the court's only spectators, and today they seemed resentful of the interruption of their comfortable routine. When they spoke, their voices sounded casually important. The conversation was about my father. "Thinks he knows what he's doing," one said. "Oh, now I wouldn't say that," said another. "Atticus Finch is a deep reader, a mighty deep reader." "He reads all right, that's all he does," the club snickered. "Let me tell you something now, Billy," a third said. "You know that court appointed him to defend this nigger." "Yeah, but Atticus aims to defend him. That's what I don't like about it." This was news that put a different light on things. Atticus had to, whether he wanted to or not. Okay, pause. That line, he aims to defend him. So Atticus was given this case and he has to do it. But he actually is going to try. He is going to defend him. He's going to do everything he can. At that time, and sometimes now, you have a white lawyer defending a black man accused of a crime against a white person, a woman in this situation. The lawyer defending the black man would not do very much, would go through the motions, probably tell them to plead guilty. So when Atticus aims to defend him, meaning he's going to actually try. I thought it odd that Atticus hadn't said anything to us about it. We could have used that many times in defending him and ourselves. He had to. That's why he was doing it. Equaled fewer fights and less fussing. But did that explain the town's attitude? The court appointed Atticus to defend him. Atticus aimed to defend him. That's what they didn't like about it. It was confusing. The Negroes, having waited for the white people to go upstairs, began to come in. Whoa, now, just a minute, said a club member holding his walking stick. Don't just don't start up them stairs there yet a while. The club began its stiff-jointed climb, ran into Dill and Jem on their way down looking for me. They squeezed past and Jem called, Scout, come on, there ain't a seat left. We have to stand up. Look at there now, he said irritably as the black people surged upstairs. The old men ahead of them would take most of the standing room. We were out of luck and it was my fault, Jem informed me. We stood miserably by the wall. Can't y'all get in? Reverend Sykes was looking down at us, black hat in hand. Remember Reverend? He was the preacher at Cal's church. I gotta hear at least that bothers me. Reverend Sykes edged his way. Hey, Reverend, said Jem. Nah, Scout here messed us up. Well, let's see what we can do, said the Reverend. Reverend Sykes edged his way upstairs. In a few moments, he was back. There's not a seat downstairs. Do y'all reckon it'd be all right if you came up to the balcony with me? Gosh, yes, said Jem. Happily, we sped ahead of Reverend Sykes to the courtroom floor. There, we went up the covered staircase and waited at the door. Reverend Sykes came puffing behind us and steered us gently through the black people in the balcony. 4 Negroes rose and gave us their front row seats. The colored balcony ran along 3 walls of the courtroom like a second-story veranda, and from it we could see everything. The jury sat to the left under long windows. Hold on. So all the white folks are down on the lower floor, and then the balcony, which kind of is like a U shape around the top, that's where all the black folks are. And Scout and Dill and Jem. When I think of this layout, I think of if you've ever been to Disneyland, if you've been to the Golden Horseshoe, where there's like the balcony up high, it's kind of like that. But you also have to note the 3 little white faces amongst all of the black people upstairs. The jury sat to the left under the long windows. Sunburned, lanky, they seemed to be all farmers. But this was natural. Townfolk rarely sat on juries. They were either struck or excused. 1 or 2 of the jury looked vaguely dressed up Cunninghams. That's a little hint. At this stage, they sat straight and alert. The circuit solicitor and another man, Atticus and Tom Robinson, sat at the tables with their backs to us. There was a brown book and some yellow tablets on the solicitor's table. Atticus's was bare. Just inside the railing that divided the court, the witnesses sat on cowhided bottom chairs. Their backs were to us. Judge Taylor was on the bench, looking like a sleepy old shark, his pilot fish riding rapidly below in front of him. Judge Taylor looked like most judges I had ever seen. Amiable, white-haired, slightly ruddy-faced. He was a man who ran his court with an alarming informality. He sometimes propped his feet up. He often cleaned his fingernails with a pocket knife. In long equity hearings, especially after dinner, he gave the impression of dozing off to sleep, an impression dispelled forever when a lawyer once deliberately pushed a pile of books to the floor in a desperate effort to wake him up. Without opening his eyes, Judge Taylor murmured, "Mr. Whitley, do that again and it'll cost you $100. He was a man learned in the law, and although he seemed to take his job casually, in reality he kept a firm grip on any proceedings that came before him. Only once was Judge Taylor ever seen at a dead standstill in open court, and the Cunninghams stopped him. Old Sarum, their stamping grounds, was populated by 2 families, separate and apart in the beginning, but unfortunately bearing the same name. The Cunninghams married the Conninghams until the spelling of the names was academic. Academic until a Cunningham disputed a Conningham over land titles and took it to the law. During a controversy of this character, James Cunningham testified that his mother spelled it Cunningham on deeds and things, but she was really a Conningham. This is lame, this part. She was an uncertain speller and a seldom reader, and was given to looking far away sometimes when she sat on the front gallery in the evenings. After 9 hours of listening to the eccentricities of the Salem inhabitants, Judge Taylor threw the case out of court. When asked upon which grounds, Judge Taylor said, "Chapertus convivience," and declared that he hoped God and the litigants were satisfied by each having their public say. They were. That was all they had wanted in the first place. That was a little backstory there. Judge Taylor had one interesting habit. He permitted smoking in the courtroom, but he did not himself indulge. Sometimes, if one was lucky, one had the privilege of watching him put a long, dry cigar into his mouth and munching it slowly up. Bit by bit, the dead cigar would disappear to reappear some hours later as a flat, slick mess, its essence extracted and mingling with Judge Taylor's digestive juices. Gross. I once asked Atticus how Mrs. Taylor stood to kiss him, but Atticus said they didn't kiss very much. The witness stand was to the right of Judge Taylor, and when we got to our seats, Mr. Heck Tate was already on it. So now, that's the end of chapter 16. That is the beginning of the trial. Everything's set. Everybody's where they are. We're going to get our first witness here in just a second. End of chapter 16.